Hello everyone, Kibler here, and we have quite a few changes to discuss coming with the patch that launched today. So we got patch notes and the patch in the very same day, which has been kind of a tradition lately in Hearthstone. Get changes right away, which I'm very happy about because this metagame has been one that I have not been thrilled with. I was actually thinking of doing a video with my thoughts on what they should change, but I was out of town this weekend in Las Vegas for a Magic event. Ended up not doing that, and then boom, changes announced. So glad I didn't spend that time making a video about what they should change, only to have them change things immediately. So let's take a look at what got changed in the patch. First things first, we have Shield Shatter. So Warrior has been pretty much the predominant control archetype that has existed in the current metagame, as well as one of the combo archetypes. And a major part of that has been its ability to generate tons of armor and use that armor via Shield Shatter and Shield Slam as removal. And the change that they decided to make to the Warrior, at least removal suite, was changing Shield Shatter from dealing 5 damage to dealing 4, while retaining the sort of armor and discount ratio, essentially, to make it still work with Frozen Buckler as it was kind of initially launched with. I think this change is okay. I do like the reduction in the power of Shield Shatter because Shield Shatter has been pretty outrageous. I honestly would have liked to see some sort of change to the armor generation. There is a minor one that they did make. Frankly, I would have just preferred to not see Shield Block in the core set. Obviously, that's a bit of a tougher change to make in sort of a minor balance patch. But Shield Block, I think, is one of the major offenders in terms of just giving Warrior armor generation that costs them basically nothing. And their removal, especially with something like Shield Shatter, keying off of that just makes it so easy for them to just churn through their deck, generating armor, building up more and more armor, and killing all your stuff. I do like this change. It is something that will definitely change the way that we look at like minions. Like for instance, any 5 health minion is a lot better now, right? Something like a Spirit Guide out of Priest is much stronger now that it doesn't die to Shield Shatter. And I think that we'll sort of reevaluate 5 health minions like, say, Wild Panol, which also got nerfed but still has 5 health, and make them much more difficult for warriors to deal with. So it'll really, I think, shake things up for those specific minions. Next up, we have From the Depths. So From the Depths is a card that I actually was surprised to not see nerfed in the last pass. When the last balance update came out, I was expecting to see From the Depths change in some capacity because I did feel like it was such a powerful element of Warrior's ability to really take over games, both from a control perspective to be able to play out cheap removal in the early turns, cheap big things to sort of take over the game, as well as contributing to the power level of the combo versions of Warrior by reducing the cost of things like Galvangar or Battleground Battlemaster, Mr. Smite, or Faceless, things like that. So the difference in potential nerfs, I think I had thought that maybe reduce the amount that it reduces the cost by increasing the cost of the card to 4. I think it's actually a harsher nerf for 2 reasons. One, it really takes a spot in the Warrior curve that they didn't have much to do, and moves it into a part where there's a lot of competition. Previously, you typically only really had like Shield Block as a turn 3 play alongside From the Depths, and now you have From the Depths competing with Outrider's Axe and School Teacher, as well as, because From the Depths now costs 4, you can't get it off of the Noggling off of School Teacher anymore. So that's a huge difference in terms of the way that not just the card itself, but the overall game plan of these Warrior decks has played out. The number of times that someone has like, Noggling for School Teacher so that like their entire deck ends up being reduced in some capacity. It really, really messes up the way that the deck has functioned up to this point. So I think this is actually a very, very big nerf. And I expect this to have a significant impact on both the win rates and play rates of Warrior, because it becomes a lot clunkier as far as the curve is concerned, because they have so much competition, as I mentioned, at the 4 slot. So I do like this change. I'm not sure whether this or changing the amount that the card reduces would have been sort of a smoother change. This may have a bigger impact on how the decks are built, not just their power level. Next up, we have another Warrior card, Nelly's pirate ship. So this is obviously the colossal appendage for Nelly, and the change to this, rather than they cost 1 for the pirates that you get from the Death Rattle, they cost 1 less. This is a very big difference, obviously. And actually, for one, I think that the Nelly into Smite into things kill you was always a super frustrating play pattern that came out of this card. But also, I felt like it was kind of boring that you basically just always wanted to pick the most expensive pirate, right? It was always correct, almost always correct, to just take the biggest thing because they all cost 1. This makes it a much more interesting decision as to what you put into Nelly's pirate ship. And I think makes the card much more dynamic in that way. It obviously also just makes it much weaker, right? Because you don't just get to Nelly's pirate ship into Smite into a bunch of stuff kill you. And I think that this was obviously a card that needed to be toned down. So I feel like this is, obviously a great change in terms of reducing the power level and the frustrations of the play pattern of this card, but also makes it a more interesting card to play because the decisions aren't just obvious of take the biggest thing basically every time. Next up, we have a non-warrior card. Well, I guess it actually sort of is a warrior card these days. Oh, no, we do have a warrior card. Hold on. We got one more warrior card. We're doing it live. Title Revenant. I referred to this a little bit earlier when I was talking about Shield Shatter and just how much armor gain that warrior has. Title Revenant being nerfed. This is interesting because this is a new inclusion in some of the warrior decks. Wasn't actually even in every warrior deck. But basically just takes a little bit of the armor gain off of some of the incidental armor that Warrior was able to generate through just kind of all the stuff that it has. And, you've obviously all who play Hearthstone with any regularity recently have played against Warrior who generate like 30, 40 armor. And having things that gain 5 armor, 8 armor, 10 armor, whatever, all obviously add to that just like accumulation that makes it so frustrating to try and kill them, and also makes their cards that key off of armor like Shield Slam. I was gonna say Shield Shatter and went to say Shield Slam. This is what happens when you do it live. Like Shield Slam and Shield Shatter makes them just that much more powerful. So this is just a bit of a knock on a card that was a contributor to that huge amount of armor generation, which I think is fine. Again, I probably would have preferred to see some of the changes to some of the higher impact stuff, like Shield Block. But again, that's more of a just wish it wasn't in standard right now and hadn't been chosen to be put in a core set with the level of armor generation and the ability to leverage that armor generation that Warrior already has. So next up, as we spoiled School Teacher. School Teacher, so School Teacher is an interesting card because a lot of people were like, oh, School Teacher should be nerfed because it's in tons of decks. And according to the data that Alico, the person in charge of at least the communications for the final design team, said on Twitter, was that it was the most played card in Standard right now, which totally get. It's a very strong neutral. I'm not sure I like this change. I think that School Teacher is one of my favorite cards in Standard right now. I definitely feel like this is a card that was really good, but I think it was very good in a very interesting way. And I would have preferred if it wasn't hit quite so hard, because at 4/3, now this dies to Tooth of Nefarian, Outrider's Axe. It dies to Wildpaw Cavern minions. It dies to a lot, right? It dies to Predation for free out of Demon Hunter. I feel like it was a huge, huge hit to what I think was kind of a ubiquitous role player, but not a dominant card by any means in Standard. So yes, it was the most played card in the format, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that it's a card that has to be hit this hard. I would have loved to just see it as 4/4, right, instead of 5/4, like a minor hit, rather than this big of a hit, which I think makes it drop down dramatically in playability. It gets value traded by Null now, which is still going to be free because it was only changed in terms of its power. So I feel this is a huge, huge hit to School Teacher, and I think School Teacher is one of the most interesting cards in the format, and I'm a little bit sad to see it hit this hard. Next up, we have... Let's go to Demon Hunter. We have Battle-Worn Vanguard. So, while Warrior was the preeminent control deck in Standard, Demon Hunter has been kind of the preeminent aggro or mid-range style deck, and it has the ability both to snowball games out of control early with the Naga plus this guy plus weapon and sort of thing starts, as well as just win the game late, whether with Jace and a ton of fell spells or Zalagnaros. And they decided they wanted to hit kind of elements of each of that, right? Make it a little bit less snowbally early and a little bit less explosively dominant late. And this was the early game card they decided to hit to basically make it just easier to remove. This is a huge change, right? Going from 2 to 1 health makes Battle-Worn Vanguard now vulnerable to hero powers across a bunch of different classes, makes it dramatically worse in the mirror match where, you previously had to have some additional card on top of your hero power to kill it. Now it just dies to a hero power against Demon Hunter. It dies to ping from Mage, dagger from Rogue, etc., etc., etc. So this is a very big change. I think this change is also fine. This card was incredibly powerful, snowballing the board. This makes things like Condemn out of Priest no longer just too slow because you needed to hit 5 mana before it could kill their 2-drop. That also made more 1/1s. So, this not only, I think, reduces the stocks of Battle-Worn Vanguard, but potentially increases the stocks of Condemn if Battle-Worn Vanguard does continue to see play. Also, like Wild Pyromancer, much more easy to kill it. You don't have to play 2 spells, you just play the 1 and clear all of them. So I think it's a good nerf. I feel like this is one of those, like, oh god, they have Vanguard on 2 kind of things that really could let games get out of control, and it was resilient to most of the mass removal that you could play at that point in the game. And now it is, yes, if your opponent immediately kills this, you probably still have 2 1/1s, so it's still a profitable thing, but it just doesn't get out of control quite as quickly, or rather is harder for your opponent, harder to get out of control quite as quickly because your opponent can remove it more easily. Like I said, doing it live. And as far as hitting the other elements of Demon Hunter, we have the change to Keria Felsoul. So previously, Keria Felsoul was a 6-cost 6/6 that made a 6/6 copy of a demon in your deck. Now, it is a 7-cost 7/7 that makes a 7/7 copy of a demon in your deck. And I think the big reason that this was changed was because of Zillag, aka Zalagnaros. And people would play Keria and just Zillag in their decks. So every time you played a Keria, as long as you hadn't drawn Zillag, you got a Zillag, and then you can play a Zillag later if they manage to somehow survive the early Zillag. And I saw some comments online that were like, well, obviously what you use Keria for is to accelerate out a big demon early, and now this doesn't really do it. And yes, I think that's certainly a fair point. But I do think that the buff to Zillag kind of necessitated a change to Keria because Zillag is actually very powerful at 7 and outrageously powerful at 6. There aren't that many ways to clear all of that. Even Shield Shatter didn't do it before. It obviously killed all of the small things, but only after it had dealt 8 damage and still left the body in play. So yeah, Keria, I think, was just a bit too strong. Really ended up putting people way, way behind very, very early in the game. And was very difficult for most classes to deal with. So I think this is a totally reasonable change that I'm happy to see. Like I said, cutting down on the early game snowballing and the late game power. This is a good hit for that. Next up, we have Paladin in the form of Lightforged Keria. And this, Alico said on Twitter that this was among the changes that was more of a feel change than necessarily a data change of, oh, Paladin is dominant, and we need to nerf, specifically Cariel. It was more like, Cariel is clearly the outlier card in these decks, and too much of their power is in this individual card. And it is better to nerf this card and be able to give them power elsewhere, rather than leave this card how it is and make the rest of their cards have to be bad. Which I totally understand. Cariel it has been, really defining pretty dominant card in a lot of instances. And I think the change to 8 slows down the pace at which you can get stuff like the hero power online, as well as reducing the impact of the board clear that it can do early on in the game, while still enabling late game clears alongside equality and such. So, I don't think that there's too many people who'll be like, oh no, Cariel was bad, it didn't need to be nerfed. Cariel was clearly the strongest card in the Cariel decks, and I like nerfing it ahead of, say, releasing a new set. So now you can actually make good Paladin cards without Paladin kind of being over the top, because it does have this sort of one linchpin component that was just a bit too good. Next up, another sort of Paladin card, but also a card that people have been cheering to get nerfed for a while, Mr. Smite. Mr. Smite's a card that people have been like, I can't believe Mr. Smite was printed, blah, blah, blah. They Hall of Fame Leroy, and they printed Mr. Smite. Have actually been of the opinion that Mr. Smite has been okay. But I have disliked how Mr. Smite combined with a lot of stuff to enable like huge damage combos. And this change to Mr. Smite makes it so that it is harder to use Mr. Smite in those big burst damage combos because of the cost. It also just makes him a marginally worse mid-game just damage minion to kill your opponent, which I think is good. But also makes it so that, like, for instance, you can't Mr. Smite, prep, boat, and gone fishing and just blow your opponent up for a massive amount of damage without any kind of additional mana reduction, right? So I think that's a very nice change to Mr. Smite. I think that he has, been a pretty frustrating card for a lot of people. And if you want to get unnerfed Mr. Smite, you can just play Nelly. And Nelly gives you Mr. Smite, and now he's back to costing 6. But yeah, also he is better with better from a mana perspective with cards like Shadow Step. It makes it so you can't like Smite, Shadow Step, Smite in the same turn anymore. It's harder to combine him with as many pirates or like Edwin and Shadow Steps and things like that. So I just generally like this change. I don't think anyone is going to be like, man, Mr. Smite just didn't deserve that. Mr. Smite has been a card that people have been complaining about for a very long time. And despite the fact that I think that the rhetoric surrounding, I can't believe they Hall of Famed Leroy and printed Mr. Smite, I think is misguided, because Leroy is Hall of Fame because it was a classic card that would otherwise be around forever. Mr. Smite's a card in expansion that will rotate. These are different things that people need to wrap their heads around. I do think that Mr. Smite being nerfed is a totally reasonable thing, given the suite of cards that have come out surrounding him that make him much more deadly. All right, next up, we have, I think, some cards that people may be a little bit surprised to see nerf. Earthen Scales. Earthen Scales is a card that I think people are like, well, Druid isn't busted now. Why would you nerf Earthen Scales? And I think, again, much like I was discussing with Cariel, it's sort of a forward-looking thing. I think Earthen Scales, in a world where Druid has the ability to generate massive amounts of mana thanks to Guff and, has like miracle growth and things like that, it's just too easy to gain tons of armor with Earthen Scales. It's really difficult for a deck that's looking to kill your opponent to bust through all of the ridiculous amount of armor gain that Druid is capable of generating. And Earthen Scales, frankly, in that world is kind of nuts, right? Like, being able to, like, Ibis, Innervate, Earthen Scales, gain 30 life or whatever was sort of stupid, right? So making Earthen Scales no longer innervatable by a single Innervate when you've spent all your mana in a turn, I think is a very reasonable change. And I think the card is still likely to be quite strong in those decks that are generating big minions, because it's giving you tons of armor for still a very cheap cost. But the increase from 1 to 2 is pretty huge, in particular in a class that does have Innervate and thus has much easier access to just getting 1 free mana in a lot of instances. So again, I don't feel like this is a card, a nerf that is targeted at the metagame right now, so much it is targeted at more holistically like what Druid is capable of doing and looking forward to future sets. And next up we have Lash Siren. Lash Siren went from a 4-cost 2/5 to a 5-cost 2/6. And frankly, I like this change. I do think Naga Mage is an interesting deck. I feel like it is kind of too fast a deck in terms of how quickly it was able to go off with Lash Siren, particularly in combination with 0-cost spells and whatnot. This plus like Flurry plus whatever, just like chaining everything, was always like kind of obnoxious. And there's a lot of just keep doing things until they die. This also does make it significantly more resilient, right? This no longer comes close to dying to Shield Shatter, because this got its toughness buffed and its health buffed. My Magic and Hearthstone brains sometimes collide, power and toughness versus attack and health. But I feel like this is rather Alico stated, this is more of a like, there was too much of the power of this deck was in this card, and you're probably better off if this card isn't just like crazy powerful, and you can have more of the other cards in the deck be interesting and powerful in addition, rather than like, having to balance everything around despite Lash Siren being quite so good. And next up, we have Wild Puddle. Wild Puddle got its nerf fully reverted in the last patch, and now had its nerf somewhat unreverted in this patch. It's now went from a 6-cost 3/5 to a 5-cost 4/5 back to a 5-cost 3/5. So I love Wild Puddle. I hate Maestra. Which isn't to say that I don't think Maestra is a cool card. I hate Maestra being the reason that Wild Puddle sees play and is good. And given that there seems to be resistance to changing how Wild Puddle works with Maestra, I do agree that this card probably needed to be toned down a bit. I just wish that Wild Puddle was a reward for actually playing a Thief Rogue card, Thief Rogue deck that used Thief Rogue cards rather than for trading Cutlass, right? Because right now, you just play like cards that draw cards. You like trade a Cutlass, play Shroud of Concealment, and play your Knolls. You never played a Thief card the entire game. You just started with Maestra in your deck. And I think that the things that like give you tempo advantages from playing Thief Rogue cards, like the Wild Puddles of the world, like the Vendettas of the world, I think those are really cool cards. And I think that the goal of those, to me, philosophically, seems to be, well, when you're spending your mana stealing stuff, you need some way to gain back that tempo by having things that are discounted or free. And all of that is kind of broken. That dynamic is broken when the reduction comes from just having Maestra somewhere in your deck, having started in your deck, and then playing cards that draw you cards in whatever capacity, whether it's trading or card draw. And I would vastly prefer to see Wild Puddle be better and trigger off of actually playing those cards that steal cards, that create cards from other classes, rather than having to be nerfed because Maestra enables it so incredibly easily. So it seems that Team 5 has gone a different direction and is happy with leaving Maestra how it is and the interaction with Null how it is. I don't like that, but that's where we're at. And I do think that the change to Null is necessary given that context. Interestingly, the change to Null coming at the same time as the change to School Teacher does mean that Null beats School Teacher in a fight now. But it is a dramatic change for a number of other cards in the metagame, right? Null will no longer be able to kill like Bolner or Bran, or any number of other cheap things that you might play with 4 health is a really big deal, right? It doesn't actually kill like you can tell I've been playing Shaman a lot recently. The minions that come off of Canyon, right? There's a lot of things that Null previously killed that it does not anymore. And much like the dynamic of the shift with Shield Shatter, you have the dynamic of the shift with Null. And if Rogue remains popular, those 4 health minions are going to be in a lot better shape. So, but again, overall, I think this needed to be changed if they're sticking with the direction they are with Maestra. I would prefer they changed how Maestra interacted with it. And I believe we are on to the final card to be nerfed, which isn't even a standard card, it's Lightning Bloom. I don't really have too much to say about this. I did want to include it in here because it was in the patch, and it was a constructed card change. It is a wild card change. Lightning Bloom isn't legal in standard. It's wild to see that this card still has Overload 2, while it's gone from add 2 mana crystals to refresh 2 mana crystals. My understanding is that like Big Shaman and such was outrageously powerful in Wild and creating some really unpleasant game experiences by ending things super quickly. But again, I don't really have much to say about that. It is good to see that Blizzard is taking the approach of actually making balance changes to Wild rather than saying it's Wild, live with it, which could be an approach saying, hey, it's Wild, it's meant to be ridiculous. But obviously Lightning Bloom was a crazy powerful card when it's in standard, and now that it is in a format that has all of the high-powered stuff throughout Hearthstone's history, has far more powerful things to potentially interact with, and probably a good thing to downpower it. So anyway, those are all the changes that we got. As I said, I do feel like there has the potential to be a pretty significant shift. in the metagame. 5 health minions are a lot better shape thanks to the change to Shield Shatter. We can see perhaps more mid-range decks arising due to that. I do expect to see fewer decks that are like, combo killing people, at least from Warrior, as well as fewer like one-turn kills available from Rogue, thanks to the change to Mr. Smite. I am a little bit worried that we didn't see any changes to either Celestial Alignment or Boar Priest, which were two of my picks for like most frustrating decks that do exist in Standard right now. Some of their better matchups were the Warrior decks, so maybe the metagame will shift to push them out because there are far fewer Warrior decks for them to prey upon. We may see fewer of those decks on ladder, which at least, while it doesn't change the actual interactions that those decks have with other people playing against them, does make them less likely to show up and thus less likely to frustrate people like me who, want to play some honest games of Hearthstone. But yeah, overall, very happy with this set of changes, even if there are some things that I would have done differently. And I'm excited to see what opportunities we have for new sweet stuff in Hearthstone. So let me know what you think, and thank you all very much for watching. I will see you all next time, or perhaps on the ladder playing sweet decks.